There is a fundamental trust we place in the world around us. A set of unwritten, unspoken rules we believe nature abides by. The sun rises in the east. Gravity holds us to the earth. Water flows downhill. And trees are stationary. They are the silent, unmoving anchors of our landscape. Their roots dug deep into the soil, a testament to permanence and stability. We measure our lives against them, marking our fleeting years against their centuries-old patience. But what if one of those fundamental rules was not as rigid as we believed? What if, in the deepest, most ancient corners of the world, under the unblinking eye of technology, we captured proof that this trust was misplaced? My name is Arthur Coleman. For 32 years, I was a park ranger at Goliath Grove National Park. I dedicated my life to that place, to its preservation, its study, and its sanctity. I've seen wildfires that turned the night sky orange and floods that redrew the maps of riverbeds. I've tracked mountain lions and comforted lost hikers. I thought I knew that forest's every secret. I was wrong. What I am about to share with you is not a ghost story. There are no vengeful spirits or mythical beasts in this tale. The truth I've found is often far more terrifying. This is a story about the trees, and how sometimes they move. Welcome to the Wilderness Protocol. To truly understand what happened, you must first understand the place. Goliath Grove is not just a park. It is a living relic. It's a vast, sprawling sanctuary of old-growth timber, a world dominated by coast redwoods, the Sequoia sempervirens and their colossal cousins, the giant sequoias. These are not merely trees. They are geological entities that happen to be alive. To walk among them is to feel a sense of profound insignificance, to be a momentary guest in a cathedral that has stood for 3,000 years. The silence in the grove is not an absence of sound. It's a presence. It's a weight composed of damp earth, the resinous scent of ancient bark, and the sweet, loamy perfume of decay that fuels the next millennium of life. For 30 years, this was my office, my church, my home. My role as a senior park ranger was a tangible one. It involved the grit of trail maintenance, the science of wildlife management, and the constant, vigilant duty of fire watch. For most of my career, that vigilance was an analog affair. It was the feel of well-worn binoculars in my hands as I scanned the horizon from the cramped cabin of the Hercules Peak Fire Tower. It was the smell of ozone in the air that signaled a distant lightning strike. It was a knowledge learned through calloused hands, weary legs, and an intimate familiarity with the forest's rhythms. I believed you had to be in the wilderness to understand it. You had to feel its breath on your skin. Then, around 2018, the breath of the wilderness was scheduled for a digital upgrade. The Park Service, in its infinite and often detached wisdom, had secured a massive federal grant for a technological overhaul. The initiative was called the Wilderness Sentinel Project, a name that sounded both impressive and vaguely Orwellian. The stated goals were noble and logical, providing unparalleled early fire detection, enabling non-invasive monitoring of endangered wildlife populations, and enhancing hiker safety in the park's more treacherous regions. In practice, this meant the installation of a park-wide, state-of-the-art surveillance network. Dozens of high-resolution, solar-powered cameras were to be deployed, many in areas so remote they required helicopters to ferry in the equipment and specialized technicians. These were not the grainy, fisheye security cameras you see in a parking garage. They were scientific instruments of the highest caliber. They boasted 8K resolution, powerful zoom capabilities, sensitive night vision, and thermal imaging that could detect a mouse's body heat from 100 yards. Crucially, they were designed for long-term observation, with the ability to record program time-lapse over days, weeks, or even months, compressing the slow life of the forest into a fluid, digestible format. I'll be honest, I hated the idea. I was a man of dirt and pine needles, not data streams and pixels. To me, this felt like an attempt to sterilize the wilderness, to place a screen between us and the very thing we were supposed to be protecting. I saw it as a crutch for a new generation of rangers who, I feared, would learn the forest from a climate-controlled room rather than from the soles of their boots. But I was in the twilight of my career, a relic myself in some ways. The younger rangers were, for the most part, thrilled, and none more so than Ben Carter. Ben was everything I wasn't. He was in his late 20s, whip-smart, and saw the world through a native understanding of technology. Where I saw a complex user interface, he saw an elegant design. He could write simple code to automate data sorting and spoke the language of bandwidth and server latency with a fluency I reserved for identifying bird calls. He was a good ranger, respectful of my experience, but he viewed the Sentinel project as a revolutionary tool, the dawn of a new age of conservation. Given his expertise, he was naturally put in charge of managing the system, of wrangling the torrential flood of visual data that now poured into our main ranger station, 24 hours a day. For the first year, the system was an unqualified success, and I had to eat my words. My old-fashioned skepticism was forced into a quiet retreat. In July of that first year, the system flagged a plume of smoke from a lightning strike on Pinewood Ridge just 7 minutes after it started. It was in a bone-dry, inaccessible area. Without the camera, we wouldn't have spotted it for an hour, maybe more. By then, it could have become an inferno. Instead, we had air tankers dropping retardant on it before it had grown larger than a school bus. The system had paid for its price tag in that single afternoon. It gave us breathtaking footage of the elusive Sierra Nevada red fox, confirming a breeding pair we thought had long since left the area. It helped us track the migratory path of our main elk herd with an accuracy we'd only ever dreamed of. Proved its worth. The unblinking eyes on the mountainsides became a trusted part of our team. Most of the footage, of course, was monumentally boring. Hours upon hours of trees standing perfectly still. A deer flicking its ear. Sunlight filtering through the canopy in shifting patterns. Fog rolling through a valley like a slow-motion wave. To make this deluge of data manageable, Ben relied heavily on the time-lapse function. He had most cameras set to capture one high-resolution frame every 60 seconds. At the end of the day, he could run a script that would stitch these 1,440 individual photographs into a single 60-second video. The entire rhythm of a day sunrise, the dance of shadows, sunset, the passage of stars compressed into a flowing minute. It was in one of these compressed, accelerated worlds that the first crack in reality appeared. It was a Tuesday in late October. The air was crisp, and the sky had that deep, polished blue of autumn. I was at my desk in the main office, catching up on incident reports, the mundane paperwork that is the foundation of any bureaucracy. Ben was at his workstation, a semicircle of large monitors that looked more like a NORAD command center than a ranger station. He was doing his routine review of the previous day's time-lapse. He suddenly stopped typing. "Huh," he said, the sound soft, almost subconscious. He leaned forward, his face just inches from the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Mountain lion take down a deer on camera?" I asked, my attention still on a particularly convoluted workers' comp form. "No, nothing that exciting," he replied, his eyes still locked on the monitor. "It's probably just a glitch. You should look at this, though." I sighed, pushing the paperwork aside, and walked over. The screen showed the feed from camera 17. I knew its location well. A high, rocky outcrop looking down into a dense, primordial basin we called the Verdant Maze. It was a particularly wild and disorienting section of the park, a labyrinth of ancient redwoods and steep ravines, closed to all public access. Ben replayed the time-lapse. It was a 24-hour capture from the day before. The video began with the pre-dawn gray, blossomed into the bright light of day, and then faded back into the inky blackness of night, all in 60 seconds. The sun arced across the sky like a tracer bullet, and the long shadows of the trees swept across the forest floor like the hands of a giant clock. The trees themselves, massive redwoods, stood as sentinels, just as they had for 1,000 years. "I don't see anything, Ben," I said, ready to go back to my forms. "Looks like every other time-lapse you've shown me." "Don't watch the whole frame. Watch the individuals," he instructed, his voice tense with focus. "Okay. See the big one on the left? The one with the lightning-scarred, split crown. We call it Old Moses. Now, look at that tight cluster of 3 smaller ones on the right, near the creek bed." He played the clip again. This time I watched as he directed. My brain struggled to process it. It was so subtle, so utterly contrary to all experience, that I almost missed it. Old Moses, a tree that weighed hundreds of tons, seemed to lean. It wasn't the fluid, rapid sway of a tree in the wind. The footage showed a calm day. This was a slow, majestic, and deeply unsettling shift of its entire colossal trunk. As the accelerated day unfolded, it moved, perhaps only a fraction of a degree, to the right. It ended the day in a slightly different position than it had started. At the same time, the cluster of trees on the right seemed to do the opposite. The gap between them, a space I'd hiked through myself, appeared to have narrowed, as if they were huddling closer together. My mind immediately jumped to a rational explanation. It had to be the equipment. "It's a lens warp," I said, the words feeling solid and comforting. "The sun heats the housing during the day. The lens expands by a micron or two. Then it cools at night and contracts, creating a slight distortion like a funhouse mirror. That's all." Ben was already typing, his fingers flying across the keyboard. My first thought, too. Running a full remote diagnostic on the camera 17 housing and lens assembly. He looked at a different monitor where lines of code and data were scrolling. No. Housing temperature variance was 0.8 degrees Celsius over the 24-hour period, well within the 5-degree operational tolerance. The system's internal gyros show no distortion or pressure on the lens. "Everything is green." "All right," I countered, not ready to give up on logic. "Ground settling. We're in earthquake country. A microtremor, something too small for us to feel, could have shifted the camera mount by a millimeter." "Possible," Ben conceded. He was already pulling up another window, this one displaying the live data feed from the park's 3 seismic monitoring stations. He isolated the quadrant for the verdant maze. The graph was a flat, boring line. "Nothing, Arthur. Not a whisper. The ground there has been more stable than this building's foundation for the last 96 hours. We spent the better part of the next hour trying to debunk what we had seen. It became a mission." Ben re-rendered the footage from the raw, individual frames, thinking it might be a software bug in the stitching process. The anomaly remained. I had him pull up the real-time footage from the same period. Frame by frame, nothing moved. The trees were rock solid. The movement was a ghost, an apparition that only appeared when the river of time was sped up. We compared it to time-lapse from a dozen other cameras. All of them showed perfectly stationary forests. In the end, we were left with no logical explanation. With a sense of weary defeat, we logged the event in the system's maintenance report as an unexplained optical anomaly, camera 17, probable intermittent sensor artifact. A fluke, a ghost in the machine. It was easier to believe the multimillion-dollar system had a bug than to believe the alternative. We had real work to do, and a video that seemed to show a tree moving a few inches over 24 hours was, in the grand scheme of park management, a low-priority curiosity. But for me, it was more than that. It had planted a seed of doubt, a tiny, cold splinter in my understanding of the world. A week later, the seed sprouted. "Arthur, you need to see this," Ben called out. It was another quiet afternoon. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tranquil atmosphere of the office. He was looking at the feed from camera 24, which was perched on a ridge nearly 5 miles away from the verdant maze, overlooking a different valley entirely. He played the time-lapse. There it was again, a different set of trees, a different angle, but the same slow, impossible motion. This time it was a subtle rotation, a giant sequoia twisting on its axis by an almost imperceptible degree. 2 days after that, it was camera 9, in the park's northern territory. A stand of redwoods engaged in what looked like a tightening of their formation. My rationalizations grew thin and ragged. A systemic flaw in the cameras? Perhaps, but why would it manifest in such a specific, organic-looking way? And why only on certain days in certain locations? Ben, however, had moved past denial and into a state of quiet, feverish obsession. He started a private log, a password-protected spreadsheet on his personal laptop, kept entirely separate from the park's official records. He began spending his evenings and days off in the station, poring over terabytes of archived footage from the day the system went live. He created a catalog of the impossible. Each entry was meticulously documented: date, camera number, time of day, weather conditions, wind speed, barometric pressure, even the phase of the moon. I grew worried. I saw a brilliant young ranger dedicating his energy to chasing what I still desperately wanted to believe was a digital illusion. I took him aside one evening as he was preparing to spend another night staring at his screens. "Ben, you need to let this go," I told him, my voice gentle. "It's a glitch. We'll find it eventually. Don't burn yourself out over a phantom." He turned from his monitor to look at me. His eyes were tired, ringed with faint shadows from lack of sleep, but they were alight with a fierce, unwavering intensity. He didn't seem like a man chasing a phantom. He looked like a man who had discovered a new, hidden continent. He lowered his voice, and the words he spoke were so simple, so direct, they chilled me to the bone. "I had a professor in college," he said, "an ecology professor. He used to tell us, 'Gentlemen, remember the most basic rule. Trees don't move.'" Ben gestured with his chin toward the screen, where a silent, time-lapsed forest was slowly, impossibly, rearranging itself in the digital twilight. "Arthur," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "ours do." In that moment, I knew this wasn't going to go away. This was not a glitch. My 32 years of experience, my fundamental understanding of the natural world, was being challenged by the unblinking eye of a camera on a lonely mountainside. And I had the terrible feeling that the camera was telling the truth. The silence of the grove no longer felt peaceful, felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to look away. The human brain is a remarkable instrument, but it is also a stubborn one. It is wired for patterns, for logic, for cause and effect. It builds a model of the world based on a lifetime of observation, and it will fight tooth and nail to protect that model. For weeks following our initial discovery, my brain was at war with itself. The seasoned park ranger, the man who had lived his life by the unyielding rules of the natural world, was in a pitched battle against the man who had seen the unblinking footage from cameras 17, 24, and 9. Every morning, I would wake up and tell myself it was a technical flaw, a cascade failure in the Sentinel system's software, so complex and esoteric that we simply hadn't found the bug yet. I would cling to this thought like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. Then I would go to the station and I would see Ben. Ben had surrendered to the phenomenon completely. His workstation had transformed from a monitoring hub into the headquarters of a singular, obsessive investigation. The bank of screens no longer just showed the live feeds. They were a mosaic of archived time-lapse, scrolling data logs, meteorological charts, and lunar calendars. His desk was littered with printouts of topographical maps covered in handwritten notes and red circles. He had lost weight, and his eyes carried a permanent intensity, the look of a cryptographer on the verge of breaking an impossible code. My flimsy explanations about software bugs would evaporate in the focused heat of his conviction. Our dynamic shifted. I became the reluctant skeptic, the sounding board for his increasingly strange theories. I played the devil's advocate, not just because I wanted to believe the world was sane, but because I felt it was my duty to exhaust every possible rational explanation before we entertained the impossible. It has to be atmospheric, I argued one rainy afternoon, pointing to a new instance Ben had flagged. Heat shimmer, thermal inversions, water vapor refracting the light over long distances. We're looking at miles of air. It's bound to get distorted. I thought of that, Ben said, without taking his eyes off the screen. He typed a few commands. So I ran a control. Last week, during that heavy marine layer, I pointed camera 14 and camera 15 at the same patch of forest. They're mounted on the same tower, just 10 feet apart. I had 14 run its standard time-lapse, 1 frame per minute. I had 15 record continuous, real-time 8K video for the entire 24-hour period. He pulled up 2 windows side by side. On the right was the real-time footage. It was beautiful in a dreary sort of way. Thick, gray fog swirled and eddied amongst the silent trunks of the redwoods. Nothing more. It was exactly what you'd expect to see. Now watch the time-lapse, he said grimly. He played the video on the left. In the compressed minute, the fog became a frantic, boiling sea. And through that sea, the trees were moving. A large cluster of them engaged in what Ben had started calling a weave. Their trunks shifting, the gaps between them subtly widening and contracting, as if they were breathing with the tide of the fog. The 2 videos showed the same scene at the same time, through lenses that were feet apart. One showed a perfectly normal, foggy day. The other showed a landscape alive with impossible motion. There's no distortion on the real-time feed, he stated flatly. Whatever this is, it's too slow to perceive normally. It's a movement that hides in plain sight, a secret kept from anything that blinks. That was the moment my denial truly began to crumble. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't an artifact. It was real. And a cold, creeping dread began to take root in my soul. My role as the devil's advocate was over. I was now his co-conspirator. I started helping him with the investigation, my decades of field experience providing a different kind of data. I brought him old soil survey maps and geological charts. We cross-referenced the locations of the movements. There was no clear pattern there. It happened on granite bedrock, on sedimentary soil, in valleys and on ridges. It wasn't tied to any specific geology. The real breakthrough came late one night. I had stayed late, unable to face the silence of my own home, and was helping Ben sift through his now massive spreadsheet. The document was his magnum opus, a testament to his obsession. It had columns for everything: date, camera ID, GPS coordinates, elevation, tree species, type of movement observed. But the last few columns were the ones he stared at the most: wind speed, barometric pressure, precipitation, cloud cover, and lunar phase. "I've been running statistical correlations, Arthur," he said, his voice hoarse from fatigue and too much coffee, "looking for any environmental trigger that lines up with the most significant events." He sorted the spreadsheet, and the pattern emerged from the noise. It was stark. The most dramatic, undeniable movements, the ones where entire groves seemed to shift, had almost all occurred under two specific sets of conditions. "Look," he said, highlighting the rose and yellow. "New moon," or "near total cloud cover and heavy fog." Every single time the movement is more than a subtle lean, it's one of those two. Darkness and obscurity. It's like he trailed off, searching for the word. It's like it waits for cover. I finished, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. The implication was staggering. It turned the phenomenon from a bizarre natural process into something that felt clandestine. Something that had an awareness of being observed. It was a terrifying leap of logic, but looking at the data laid out before us, it felt unavoidable. The forest had a secret, and it preferred to keep it in the dark. This new hypothesis had to be tested. We needed to orchestrate an observation, to point our cameras at the right place at the right time, with the intention of capturing it. We would no longer be passive observers. We would be active hunters. We consulted the calendar. The next new moon was in 3 days. It was a perfect opportunity. Now we had to choose the location. "Camera 12, I said immediately. Ben nodded in agreement. Camera 12 was special. It was located in a valley we called the Patriarch's Basin. The valley was a geographical bowl, protected from the worst of the winds, with a deep, rich soil. And in it grew some of the oldest, largest living things on planet Earth. The sequoias in that basin were true giants, ancient kings that were already saplings when humans were first learning to write. To stand in that basin was to feel like you were on a different planet or in a different eon. It was the heart of the park's ancient soul. If this movement was a feature of the oldest trees, Patriarch's Basin was the place to look. We began our preparations with the hushed gravity of scientists preparing for a critical experiment. Ben spent an entire morning running remote diagnostics on Camera 12, calibrating its sensor, checking the stability of its solar panels and battery backup. He remotely cleaned the lens using the small, automated wipers, ensuring the image was pristine. Then, he adjusted the recording parameters. Instead of 1 frame every minute, he set it to 1 frame every 10 seconds. It would generate a massive amount of data, but it would give us a time-lapse of unparalleled smoothness. If there was movement, we would see it in fluid, horrifying detail. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I went about my duties as a ranger, but it was all a pantomime. The world felt like a thin veneer over a deeper, stranger reality. During a patrol that took me near the edge of Patriarch's Basin, I stopped the jeep and just listened. The profound, heavy silence of the grove pressed in on me. I stared at the colossal, cinnamon-red trunks, their crowns lost in the sky. They were magnificent. They were unmoving, and I felt like a fool. A part of me, the rational part, desperately hoped that the night of the new moon would come and go, and the camera would show us nothing but 3 days of beautiful stationary trees. I prayed that we were wrong. The night of the new moon arrived. The forecast was perfect for our purposes. Clear skies, which meant no ambient light from cloud reflections, just the cold, distant glitter of stars. The moon was a black hole in the heavens. As per park protocol, a ranger had to be on duty in the station overnight. Ben, to no one's surprise, volunteered. He claimed he had system updates to run. I went home, but sleep was an impossibility. I sat in my armchair in the dark, picturing that lone camera on its perch. Its electronic eye aimed at the heart of the ancient grove, recording the silent secrets of the absolute darkness. I arrived at the station before the sun crested the mountains. The parking lot was empty save for Ben's car. I let myself in. The main office was silent except for the gentle hum of the servers. I found Ben exactly where I knew he would be, slumped in his chair, staring at his main monitor. He looked like he had been through a war. His face was pale, his skin clammy, and his eyes were wide and bloodshot, fixed on the screen with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He didn't turn as I approached. "Show me," I said. It was not a request. He didn't speak. He just slowly raised a trembling hand and clicked the mouse. The time-lapse from camera 12 began to play. It was a 12-hour recording of the night, compressed into roughly 2 minutes of video. The footage began with the last purple vestiges of twilight fading from the sky. The landscape dissolved into the monochromatic world of the camera's high-sensitivity night vision. The forest was bathed in an eerie, ethereal gray light. The stars, captured by the 10-second exposures, didn't twinkle. They streaked across the black sky in brilliant white arcs, a visual record of the planet's rotation. And then the trees began to move. My breath hitched in my chest. All my lingering hopes of being wrong, of this being a glitch, were utterly and completely annihilated in the first 10 seconds of the video. This was not a subtle lean. This was not a fractional shift. This was undeniable. The titans of the earth, the silent kings of Patriarch's Basin, were in motion. It was a slow, majestic, and deeply terrifying ballet. A colossal sequoia in the center of the frame, one we called the General for its immense size, rotated on its axis. It wasn't a sway. Its entire massive trunk, wide as a small house, twisted by a full 2 or 3 degrees. You could see the deep fissures of its bark crawling across its surface like canyons on a rotating planet. 100 feet away, another giant seemed to shift laterally, sliding a few feet to its left. There was no visible disturbance on the ground, no sign of uprooted soil. It just moved. But the most disturbing part was the coordination. This was not random motion. They were moving in concert, as if guided by a single, silent intelligence. The entire grove was subtly rearranging itself. Gaps between trunks that I had personally walked through widened, while other areas became impenetrably dense. It was like watching a vast, living labyrinth reconfiguring its walls. And then I saw the ground. At the base of the trees, the blanket of pine needles and soil was not still. It churned. It moved in slow, roiling waves, almost imperceptibly, like the skin on a sleeping animal's back. It was the movement of colossal roots shifting just beneath the surface, a motion so powerful and so slow that it displaced the very earth itself. We watched the entire 2-minute video in absolute, stunned silence. When it ended, leaving a static image of the grove in the pre-dawn light, I finally managed to draw a ragged breath. "My God, Ben," I whispered. "It gets worse," he said, his voice a strained croak. He hadn't taken his eyes off the screen. With a shaking hand, he used the mouse to zoom in, pushing deep into the pixelated gray at the base of the General. In the churning soil, a dark patch was visible. A shape. He toggled a different view, bringing up a second video player synchronized to the first. I ran the thermal data alongside it. The new video showed the same scene, but in the alien colors of a thermal camera. Most of the forest was a cool, mottled blue and green, but the trees that were moving, their trunks and the ground around them glowed with a faint, ghostly orange. "Friction," Ben mumbled. "The movement generates a low-level heat signature. The energy required to do this, it must be immense." He pointed his cursor at the dark shape I'd seen in the night vision footage. In the thermal view, it was not orange. It was a patch of deep, cold violet, colder than the surrounding ground. As we watched the time-lapse again, we saw the General's slow rotation first cover this cold spot, and then, hours later, uncover it again. "What is that?" I asked, a primal fear beginning to prickle at the back of my neck. "Some kind of granite outcrop?" Ben pulled up the park's geological surveys for that valley. He knew them by heart now. There are no rock formations of that shape or size recorded in the basin. It's not a boulder. He paused, and then he delivered the sentence that would shatter my world forever. Arthur, he said, finally turning to look at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying understanding. Based on the shape and that cold-as-death thermal signature, I think it's a hole, a void, a cavity in the ground that the tree is deliberately covering and uncovering. Cavity, a hole, hidden by a moving, 1,000-ton giant. The forest wasn't just moving, it was hiding something. The silence of the grove was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator, waiting patiently in its blind. We sat there for a long time, the rising sun casting pale light into the office, but the cold darkness of that valley on the screen seemed to have seeped into the room, into our very bones. We were two men who had, through the unblinking eye of a machine, stumbled upon a truth that we were never meant to see. We were no longer just rangers. We were keepers of a terrible, dangerous secret, and we had no idea what to do with it. For the next 6 months, my life was split into two irreconcilable halves. There was the daylight world, where I was Senior Ranger Arthur Coleman, a man who gave safety briefings to tourists, managed patrol schedules, and signed off on supply requisitions. It was a world of tangible things, of predictable routines and rules that made sense. But there was also the other world, the one that existed in the humming servers of the ranger station and in the quiet, gnawing dread in the back of my mind. This was the world Ben and I now inhabited, the sole citizens of a reality where the very ground was untrustworthy. We became scholars of the impossible. Ben's secret spreadsheet, which we codenamed Directive 12, after the camera that gave us our first undeniable proof, grew into a sprawling database. We developed our own private lexicon to categorize the movements, to impose a fragile sense of scientific order on the chaos. A slow, twisting motion of a single tree on its axis became a torsion shift. The unnerving lateral movement of an entire section of forest was a grove crawl, and the complex, coordinated rearrangement of a cluster of trees, like the ones that had blocked the creek bed, we called a weave. These terms were our shield, a way to discuss the phenomenon without having to speak the terrifying truth. The trees were acting with purpose. My days on the trail were forever changed. I could no longer look at a stand of ancient sequoias without a cold shiver tracing its way down my spine. I would stand at the base of a titan that had weathered 2,000 years of storms and fires, and I would imagine the colossal, slow-motion power churning in the earth beneath my feet. The profound silence of the grove, which I had once found so deeply peaceful, now felt like the held breath of a waiting predator. I was living inside a secret, and the secret was alive. Still, it remained an abstraction, a collection of terrifying videos and data points on a screen. It was a phenomenon we observed from a safe, digital distance. We were watching a horror movie, not living in one. We had no idea that the screen was about to shatter, and the horror was about to step out into our world. The change came in late May of 2019. It began, as these things so often do, with a routine phone call. Every season, Goliath Grove draws thousands of hikers. They come to be humbled by the giants, to breathe the clean air, to walk the well-marked trails. And every season, a handful get lost. They misread a map, take an ill-advised shortcut, or are simply caught out by a sudden change in weather. Search and rescue, or SAR, is a fundamental, if stressful, part of the job. You develop a thick skin for it. You learn to manage the controlled panic, to execute the search grids, to comfort the worried families. 99% of the time, the story has a happy ending: a cold, tired, but safe hiker, embarrassed and grateful to be found. This time was different. The call came in on a Monday morning from the local sheriff's department. A young man named Julian Croft, a 21-year-old geology student from UC Berkeley, had been reported missing by his roommate. Julian was an avid and experienced hiker. This wasn't a novice who had wandered off in flip-flops. He was well-equipped, had a solid sense of the outdoors, and had left a clear plan. He'd driven up for the weekend to get in a solid day hike on Saturday. He'd told his roommate he was heading for the Whispering Creek Trail loop. Then he never came home. The first gears of the SAR machine began to turn with practiced efficiency. A ranger patrol confirmed his car, a dusty blue Subaru, was still in the trailhead parking lot. That was confirmation enough. We immediately escalated to a full-scale SAR operation. I was the incident commander for the ground search, my role to coordinate the teams of rangers and volunteers, to establish search sectors, and to manage the flow of information at the command post we set up at the trailhead. Ben's role was just as critical. He was tasked with reviewing every frame of footage from the Sentinel cameras in that entire sector. Whispering Creek was a popular and fairly long trail, monitored at key points by 3 cameras, 19, 20, and 21. His job was to find any sign of Julian Croft, to establish a last known position, a direction of travel, anything that could help us narrow the vast, green wilderness into a manageable search area. For the first day, the operation proceeded by the book. Ground teams swept the trail itself, finding nothing out of the ordinary. Canine units worked the forest floor on either side of the path. The mood was professional, focused, and still optimistic. The weather had been clear on Saturday. He was young, fit, and knew what he was doing. He was probably just off-trail with a sprained ankle, waiting for us to find him. I was in the command tent, a temporary canvas structure buzzing with the crackle of radios and the murmur of quiet conversations, when I saw Ben approaching. He wasn't walking. He was stumbling, weaving through the assembled vehicles and personnel like a man in a trance. His face was the color of chalk. It was the same look of profound shock he'd worn the morning we watched the footage from camera 12. But this time it was curdled with a raw, visceral fear. He didn't speak a word. He just grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled me away from the command post, back toward the main station building. "You need to see this," he choked out, his voice thin and reedy. "Arthur, you need to see this now." He sat me down at his workstation, the place that had become our secret sanctum. He already had the footage queued up. Julian's roommate confirmed he was wearing a bright orange, technical shell jacket, Ben said, his hands hovering shakily over the keyboard. Impossible to miss. I isolated that specific color spectrum in the footage from camera 20 Saturday, the camera that overlooks the footbridge at the halfway point of the loop. He hit play. The time-lapse began. It was a clear, sunny Saturday, and the trail was busy. We saw blurs of color other hikers in blues, reds, and greens moving along the path, crossing the small wooden bridge that spanned Whispering Creek. Their motion was fluid, predictable. Then, at timestamp 11:42 and 16 seconds a.m., a brilliant flash of orange entered the frame. It was Julian. The time-lapse showed him crossing the bridge, a confident stride. He paused on the far side, and even in the compressed time, we could see the distinct motion of him pulling a map from his pocket, studying it for a moment, and then folding it away. He then continued up the trail, which bent sharply around a particularly colossal, gnarled redwood, and disappeared from the camera's view. "Okay," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. "That's it. That's our LK-Plast known position. 11:42 a.m., just past the footbridge. He was still on the trail and moving well. We can focus the ground and canine search in a half-mile radius from that bend." I reached for the radio on my belt. "Wait," Ben whispered, putting a hand on my arm to stop me. "Keep watching." He let the time-lapse continue. I watched, confused, as the accelerated day unfolded. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its descent. The shadows of the trees stretched across the landscape like dark, probing fingers. Other hikers came and went, moving in both directions on the trail. But the flash of orange never reappeared. That wasn't the part that made the blood freeze in my veins. The horrifying part wasn't what Julian did. It was what the forest did after he passed. Starting at approximately 1 p.m., a little over an hour after Julian had walked out of the frame, the anomaly began. But this was wrong. It was all wrong. This wasn't happening under the cover of a new moon or a thick blanket of fog. This was happening in the bright, clear light of a Saturday afternoon, with other hikers only minutes away. The massive, ancient redwood that guarded the bend in the trail, the very last thing the camera saw Julian walk past, began to move. It wasn't a torsion shift or a gentle lean. In the time-lapse, it looked like it was being pushed by an invisible, impossibly powerful hand. It slid, with a dreadful, silent intentionality, several feet to the left. As it moved, two other large trees from the opposite side of the path leaned inward, their great crowns tilting toward each other like closing gates. Simultaneously, the dense undergrowth of ferns and salal that bordered the trail seemed to surge, to swell with an unnatural vitality, growing visibly thicker and taller with every passing second of the footage. We watched, mesmerized and horrified, as over the course of the next 3 hours, the landscape was methodically and completely re-engineered. The clear, well-trodden path that Julian had confidently walked down ceased to exist. Where there had been a clear opening, a trail worn smooth by thousands of boots, there was now an impenetrable wall of ancient wood and densely tangled thicket. The very concept of a path in that spot was erased. Any hiker coming to that bend now would see no sign that the trail had ever continued straight. They would simply follow the new, gentle curve of the forest, a curve that now led them away in a completely different direction. We stared at the screen in dead silence. The hum of the servers seemed to roar in my ears. The implications were a physical blow. It had closed the trail behind him. I stammered, my voice a stranger to my own ears. It cut him off. It trapped him. "It's worse than that, Arthur," Ben said, his voice trembling on the edge of a sob. He switched the monitor's view to the feed from camera 21. This camera was positioned half a mile deeper into the woods, in the very direction Julian had been heading. It didn't just trap him, it hunted him. He played the time-lapse from camera 21, synchronized to the same time period. The scene was one of terrifying, organized chaos. The entire grove captured by the camera was in motion. It was a weave of a complexity we had never witnessed. Trees were engaged in a slow, coordinated dance of death, their trunks sliding and rotating, closing off corridors, opening new ones. The very topography of the forest floor seemed to be in flux. It was like watching a living, breathing maze actively reconfiguring itself to ensnare its prey. And then we saw him. For just a few frames at a time, we caught a flicker of bright orange deep within the shifting trees. It was Julian. He was far off the trail now, clearly lost, panicked, and disoriented. We watched his tiny, desperate form run into a small, sun-dappled clearing. And as he did, the trees surrounding the clearing slowly, deliberately moved inward, shrinking the open space, closing his escape route. He would scramble over a fallen log and dart into another apparent opening, only for a wall of ancient bark to slowly slide into place behind him, cutting off his retreat. We were witnessing a man being herded, not by wolves or a mountain lion, but by the forest itself. He was a mouse in a maze designed by a malevolent god. The last time we saw the flicker of orange was near the base of a gnarled, monstrously large sequoia. He appeared to stumble and fall to his knees. He didn't get up, and then, with a slow, grinding, and deliberate finality, 3 of the surrounding giants converged on that one spot. Their massive forms moved in, their trunks pressing together, until the small space where he had fallen, and the bright orange color of his jacket, was completely blotted out from the camera's view. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the movement stopped. The entire forest grew perfectly, unnaturally still. I felt the blood drain from my face. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and I leaned forward, gripping the desk to keep from being sick. This wasn't a passive phenomenon we had been studying. This wasn't a strange biological quirk. This was predation, active, intelligent, and absolutely merciless. Did you check the thermal?" The question came out as a ragged whisper. I already knew the answer. I dreaded the answer. Ben nodded grimly. His face was a mask of horror. He overlaid the thermal imaging data on the final, terrible moments of the footage. As we had seen before, the moving trees glowed with the faint heat of friction. But as the 3 giants converged on Julian's last known position, the thermal camera registered something new. At the exact spot where the orange flicker was extinguished, there was a brief, sharp, and violent spike in temperature. Not a fire. It was a flash of intense energy, a silent scream in the thermal spectrum. It flared for an instant, and then it was gone. The ground where he had been was now thermally indistinct from the rest of the forest floor. There was no lingering heat, no body, no sign that anything had ever been there. It was an act of total consumption, an erasure. We sat there for I don't know how long, the loop of a young man's last moments playing out on the screen in silent, accelerated time. The objective, scientific curiosity we once had was gone, burned away by the horror of what we had just witnessed. This was no longer about a secret. This was about a murder. The official search and rescue operation would continue for another week. The teams would find nothing. The canine units would grow agitated and confused in that area, whining and circling, unable to find a single trace of a scent. I would eventually have to sign the final report, the document that would go to the sheriff and to Julian Croft's family. It would list him as lost, presumed deceased due to environmental exposure or misadventure. Every word of it would be a lie. He wasn't a victim of misadventure. He was a victim of the wilderness itself, a wilderness that was more ancient, more intelligent, and infinitely more patient than we had ever dreamed. That night, after the search teams had packed up for the day, I went back to the station. I copied all of Ben's files, the logs, the data, and the horrific footage of Julian Croft's final hours onto a single encrypted hard drive. Our own protocol of secrecy was meaningless now. It was a dangerous self-delusion that had just cost a young man his life. I walked out into the cool night air, the hard drive heavy in my jacket pocket, and I made a call to our regional director, Eva Rostova. The time for whispering in the dark was over. The secret of Goliath Grove had to be told. There is a profound difference between a secret and evidence. For 6 months, Ben and I had carried a secret. It was a heavy burden, a strange and terrifying knowledge that warped our perception of the world. But the footage of Julian Croft's final hours was not a secret. It was evidence. It was cold, hard, irrefutable proof of a homicide. A homicide committed not by a person, but by the forest itself. The abstract fear we had lived with had coalesced into a single, horrific event. The name on the missing person report was no longer a statistic. He was a young man we had watched die. The weight of it was unbearable. The thought of the official search continuing, of teams combing the woods for a body that had been, for all intents and purposes, vaporized, felt like a grotesque parody. The thought of Julian's family waiting for news that would never come, while we held the truth on a hard drive, was a moral failing I could not accept. Our private protocol, Directive 12, had been about understanding. But understanding was no longer enough. Now, it had to be about justice, about warning others. That evening, after Ben and I had watched the footage for the final, sickening time, a decision was made. It wasn't even a conversation. We just looked at each other, the same haunted understanding in our eyes. Our silence had to end. I knew I couldn't just walk into the regional office and announce that the trees were killing people. I'd be in a padded room before lunch. This required a delicate touch. It required going directly to the top, to someone with the authority to act and the fortitude to listen to something that sounded like madness. It required director Eva Rostova. Director Rostova was a legend within the National Park Service. She was a woman carved from the very granite of the mountains she managed. She'd started her career as a field biologist in the brutal Alaskan wilderness, facing down grizzly bears and Arctic winters, and had methodically climbed the ranks of the service through sheer, uncompromising competence. She was brilliant, pragmatic, and had a reputation for suffering fools about as well as a sequoia suffers a woodpecker. She was a creature of politics and bureaucracy now, but she had dirt under her fingernails. I was gambling my career, my sanity, and my pension on the hope that the field biologist was still alive inside the director. I called her personal cell phone late that night. It was a number given only to senior staff for absolute emergencies. I imagined she was at home, probably reading some dense policy report. Rostova. Her voice was clipped, efficient, even at this hour. Director, it's Arthur Coleman at Goliath Grove. There was a slight pause. Arthur, this isn't a fire, is it? No, ma'am. It's a critical matter of park safety, and a personnel issue. I need to brief you, but it has to be in person, and it has to be completely off the record. I held my breath, expecting to be reprimanded, to be told to follow the proper channels. Instead, the pragmatist in her took over. She heard the gravity in my voice. There's a coffee shop called the Daily Grind in Oak Creek, halfway between you and me. Be there at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Come alone. The line went dead. Ben and I agreed it was the right call for me to go alone. He was too raw, too emotional. His justifiable anger would cloud the issue. I needed to present this with the cold, detached clarity of a coroner's report. I took the encrypted drive, a small, black rectangle that felt as heavy as a tombstone, and placed it in my jacket. The Daily Grind was a perfectly anonymous place, the kind of small-town coffee shop with worn linoleum floors and the slightly acrid smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air. I got there early and chose a booth in the back corner. At precisely 10 a.m., Director Rostova walked in. She was smaller in person than her reputation suggested, with sharp features and intelligent, unblinking gray eyes that seemed to assess everything at once. She moved with an efficiency that wasted no motion, got herself a black coffee, and sat opposite me. There was no small talk. Arthur, she said, her voice low, you have my undivided attention. This had better be worth the drive. I didn't embellish. I didn't speculate. I opened the laptop I'd brought, plugged in the encrypted drive, and began to present the facts as we had recorded them. My voice as steady as I could make it. I was a scientist delivering a paper. I started with the first video, the optical anomaly from camera 17. I showed her the footage of old Moses leaning. I then walked her through Ben's meticulous logs, his data charts showing the undeniable correlation between the most significant movements and the twin conditions of the new moon and heavy fog. I showed her his controlled experiment with cameras 14 and 15, proving it wasn't an atmospheric distortion. She listened without a single interruption, her gaze fixed on the screen. Her expression was a perfect, unreadable mask. She didn't look shocked, or skeptical, or amused. She simply watched, absorbing the information, her fingers steepled in front of her lips. Then, I took a deep breath and said, And this is the event that precipitated this meeting. It's the time-lapse from camera 12 in Patriarch's Basin on the night of the last new moon. I played the footage of the entire grove coming alive, of the giant sequoias twisting on their axes, of the ground churning, of the dark, cold void being covered and uncovered at the base of the general. She watched the entire 2-minute clip. When it was over, she simply said, "Play it again." Played it again. And a third time, she just nodded slowly, a single thoughtful motion. Finally, with the knot of ice in my stomach, I navigated to the last files on the drive. On Saturday, a hiker named Julian Croft went missing. This is the footage from camera 20, which monitors the Whispering Creek Trail. I played the clip. She saw the flash of orange cross the bridge. She saw him disappear around the bend. And she saw the forest methodically, impossibly, swallow the path behind him. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a tightening. "And this," I said, my voice cracking slightly, "is from camera 21, half a mile deeper in. This is what happened next." I played the final, terrible recording. I didn't narrate it. I didn't have to. The flickering dot of orange, herded like a panicked animal. The slow, inexorable convergence of the trees. The final, silent snuffing out of that little spark of life. The brief, violent flash on the thermal overlay. When it was over, I closed the laptop. The silence that fell over our table was so profound it seemed to suck the noise from the rest of the coffee shop into it. I had just shown my superior video evidence that our park, a national treasure, was home to carnivorous mobile trees. I expected her to recoil in horror. I expected disbelief, accusations, perhaps a quiet call to have me psychologically evaluated. Instead, she took a long, slow sip of her now cold coffee and stared out the window at the cars passing by on the street. Her first words were not addressed to me, but to the world at large. They were quiet, weary, and utterly chilling. "Goliath Grove," she said. It had to be the Grove. My mind short-circuited. I could only stammer, You know about this? You've seen this before." She turned her gaze back to me, and the mask was gone. In her eyes I saw no surprise. I saw a deep, ancient weariness, a sadness that went bone deep. "Not this," she said, gesturing to the laptop. "Not the cameras. Not the proof. That's new. That changes things. But the stories, Arthur, the stories are as old as the service." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You get to a certain level in this organization. You become a regional director. You get access to a different kind of archive. Not the official one. There's a ghost file, an unofficial, unacknowledged collection of cases. We call it the long-term ecological study, a perfectly boring name for a perfectly horrible subject. It's a catalog of anomalous disappearances, vanishings. Every major old-growth park has its own chapter," she continued, her voice low and intense. "The Olympic Peninsula, the Redwood Coast, Sequoia, Kings Canyon. Places where people often experienced, well-equipped people walk into the woods and simply cease to exist. No body, no clothing, no backpack, no trace. Far, far more than statistical probability and random misadventure can account for. The floor had dropped out from under my world. We hadn't made a new discovery. We had stumbled into a century-old conspiracy of silence. We've always had theories," she said, her expression grim. "Undiscovered cave systems, sudden sinkholes, even wild speculation about localized magnetic fields causing disorientation. We've sent geologists, physicists. They never found anything. We never knew what was causing it. We only knew that it happened, and that it happened in the oldest places." She tapped a finger on the closed laptop. You and your ranger haven't discovered the monster, Arthur. You've just taken its first photograph. Then we have to do something, I insisted, my voice rising with a desperate urgency. We have to release this. We have to warn the public. Close down these areas of the park. She gave a short, bitter, humorless laugh. Warn them how? Close what? Your own data shows this happening in over a dozen distinct zones. We'd have to shut down Goliath Grove entirely. And our reason? Attention visitors. The park is closed indefinitely because the trees occasionally eat people. Think about it. The disbelief, the ridicule, the global media firestorm. Scientists from every university on Earth would descend on us. And what would they find? Stationary trees. Because the phenomenon is shy. It hides. This footage, she tapped the laptop again, would be labeled the most brilliant CGI hoax in history. You and Ben would be disgraced, fired, and possibly prosecuted. And after all the noise died down, the parks would reopen, and nothing would have changed. Except the secret would be out, and the panic would be permanent. So we do nothing? I asked, aghast. We just let it happen again? We let them cover up Julian's death. No, she said, and her voice turned from weary to cold steel. We don't do nothing. We do what the service has always done when faced with an incomprehensible threat to its existence. We manage it. We contain it. We professionalize the silence. We create a new protocol. And just like that, the fate of our discovery was sealed. It was to be absorbed into the machine. What Ben and I had called Directive 12 was now to be folded into a much older, darker program. The first step, she explained, was absolute containment of the data. The laptop and the encrypted drive were now property of her office. I was not getting them back. I was to return to the station and personally oversee the complete, permanent deletion of every copy of the footage and all of Ben's research from the park's servers. I was to use a military-grade data scrubbing program she would email me a link to. Within 48 hours, a specialist tech team from the regional office would arrive, unannounced, to perform a mandatory security upgrade of the Sentinel network's data storage architecture. This was, of course, a euphemism. They were coming to professionally wipe the central archives and install new software that would flag and sequester any future recordings of the anomaly, routing them to a single, secure server that only 3 people in the entire National Park Service would have access to. The second step was containment of the personnel. Ben Carter, she explained, was a brilliant young ranger. Too brilliant to have his career stalled at Goliath Grove. She was arranging an immediate promotion for him. A prestigious, high-paying transfer to a research and technology development position at Yellowstone. It was a dream job, an offer no one in their right mind would refuse. It was also a reward designed to be in exile. It would move him across the country, away from the cameras, away from the grove he knew too much about. He was being silenced with a golden handshake. And me? I was a good ranger who had served for 32 long years. I was nearing retirement anyway. She strongly suggested I take it a few months early. A full pension, a glowing letter of commendation for a lifetime of service to be entered into my permanent record. It was a gentle, respectable, and quiet push out the door. I tried to argue. I told her it was a moral outrage, a cover-up of a man's death. But she was immovable. She painted a vivid picture of the consequences of disclosure, of the public trust in the national parks being shattered forever, of the places we dedicated our lives to protect becoming sites of fear and morbid tourism. She argued that the only way to protect the sanctity of the parks was to keep the terrible truth in the dark. In the end, exhausted and outmaneuvered, defeated by a logic that was both monstrous and inescapable, I agreed. The drive back to the park was a blur. I had walked into that coffee shop a man seeking to reveal a truth, and I had walked out a conspirator tasked with burying it. Breaking the news to Ben was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. He looked at me with betrayal in his eyes. He accused me of selling out, of being a coward, of helping them sweep Julian's murder under the rug for the sake of the bureaucracy. He wasn't wrong. Our friendship, forged in the crucible of this strange discovery, fractured and died in that moment. He took the transfer to Yellowstone without another word to me. I did as I was told. I ran the data wiping software. With every click, I felt like a historian burning the last copy of an ancient, priceless text. I watched the progress bar erase not just files, but the only proof that Julian Croft didn't just get lost. He was taken. 2 months later, I submitted my retirement papers. My career as a park ranger ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, complicit whimper. The protocol was in place. The silence was absolute. I have been retired for 5 years now. I live in a small town in the high desert of Arizona, a place of stark, sun-bleached beauty. There are trees here, stunted junipers, hardy pines, tenacious mesquite, but they are not the same. They are sparse, individualistic, their roots fighting for purchase in dry, rocky soil. They do not form groves. They do not create a canopy that blots out the sun. Their shadows are thin and sharp, and you can see for miles. I chose this place for that reason. I need to see the horizon. I need to know that the landscape is not hiding anything. My life is quiet. I have a small garden. I read history books. The locals know me as Arthur, the retired park ranger from California, a quiet man who likes his privacy. They assume I left the forests for a warmer, drier climate, a common choice for men my age whose joints have started to ache. In a way, they're right. I did leave because of an ache, but it wasn't in my bones. It was an ache in my soul, a deep, foundational fracture in my understanding of the world. I do not hike in old forests anymore. I can't. The very thought of it triggers a cold, claustrophobic panic. I cannot stand beneath the weight of a dense canopy without feeling the press of a silent, collective intelligence around me. The smell of damp earth and redwood duff, a scent that for 30 years was my perfume of choice, now brings on a wave of nausea. I cannot look at a stand of ancient trees, their trunks like the pillars of a lost temple, without imagining the slow, titanic, and utterly silent churning of the earth beneath them. The joy I once found in the wilderness is gone, replaced by a permanent, low-grade dread. The knowledge I carry has poisoned the well. This knowledge is not like a memory, which fades and softens with time. It is like a low dose of radiation I was exposed to, a contaminant that has settled deep inside me and altered my cellular structure. I can't see it, but I feel its effects every single day. The world feels thinner to me now, its physical laws more like polite suggestions than rigid rules. I look at the solid ground beneath my feet and I know, with an unshakable certainty, that it is not as solid as it seems. I spend long, sleepless nights replaying the footage in my mind, a cinema of horrors that never closes. I see the majestic, terrifying rotation of the sequoias in Patriarch's Basin. I see the forest floor roiling as if it were liquid, and always, I see that flicker of bright orange, that desperate ghost of a young man, being herded and then erased by a landscape he had come to admire. What the camera showed us was not just movement. It was a process, an ancient biological function that we, in our fleeting, frantic lifespans, are utterly unequipped to comprehend. The questions are the things that haunt me the most. They circle in the darkness of my quiet house. What is it? Is it a defense mechanism, evolved over millennia to repel a perceived threat? Did the trees, in their slow, ancient consciousness, come to see the noisy, two-legged creatures with their axes and saws as a kind of virus, and this was their immune response? Or is it something more primal? Is it a form of predation? We think of Venus flytraps and pitcher plants as botanical curiosities, but they are carnivores. What if a forest, given enough time, enough size, enough collective mass, could evolve a more sophisticated, more active form of hunting? Was Julian Croft a source of sustenance? Was that flash of thermal energy the metabolic process of a colossal, dispersed organism absorbing nutrients? The thought is vile, but I cannot dismiss it. The forest needs nitrogen, carbon, phosphates to survive. All the elements that make up a human body. And what of the coordination? That is the part that defies all conventional biology. It implies communication, a network, not the slow, chemical signals that scientists have discovered trees use to warn each other of insect attacks. This was something else. A unified consciousness, perhaps, spread across thousands of tons of living wood, a single vast intelligence operating on a geological timescale. To such a being, a human life would be like the flicker of a mayfly's wing. Our frantic movements, our brief lifespans, our entire civilization, we would be a momentary irritation, a background noise. It wouldn't hate us. It wouldn't even consider us in any way that we would recognize as thought. It would simply act, as a man might act to brush a fly from his arm, without malice or anger, just a simple, decisive motion. Then there is the question of the void, that cold, dark shape at the base of the general, the hole that the great tree so deliberately concealed. What was it? A larder, where it stored its food. A nest? A passageway to some deeper, subterranean root system we can't even imagine? I have spent countless hours staring at a blank wall, picturing that dark shape. It is the ultimate black box, the heart of the mystery, and the thought of what lies within it is a terror beyond all measure. I think about Ben often. I never heard from him again after he left for Yellowstone. I've looked him up online, of course. He's listed as a senior research scientist on the park's official website. His bio is impressive, full of technical jargon about data modeling and remote sensing networks. To the world, he is a success story. But I wonder, does he sleep at night? Or does he, like me, stare at the ceiling and see a forest dancing in the dark? Did the promotion and the distance grant him peace? Or is he still a prisoner of what we saw? I fear it's the latter. I fear he is still searching the data streams, looking for echoes of the anomaly, a man forever trying to prove a truth that the world has forbidden him from speaking. Our friendship was a casualty of the forest, too. Another thing it consumed. For 5 years, I honored the protocol. I kept the silence. I told myself that Director Rostova was right, that the world was better off not knowing, that protecting the idea of the national parks was a greater good that outweighed the terrible truth. I rationalized my complicity as a painful necessity. I buried the memory of Julian Croft under layers of pragmatic justification. I lived with the ghosts and I kept my mouth shut. Until last month. I was doing what I do most mornings. Sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee, and scrolling through the national news on my tablet. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. And then I saw it. It wasn't a major headline. It was a small, regional story from the Pacific Northwest, buried in the back pages of the site. The headline was simple. Search continues for family of 3 missing in Olympic National Park. My blood ran cold. I read the article. A couple and their teenage daughter. They had parked their car at the trailhead for a popular hike into the Hoh rainforest. They were experienced hikers, well-equipped. They had signed the trail register. They had gone in for a day hike 4 days prior and had never come out. The article mentioned that the search was being hampered by the region's famously unpredictable weather. And then I read the sentence that made me feel like I was going to have a heart attack. A quote from the local sheriff. "This is a challenging environment. The forest is incredibly dense, and this area is known for its sudden, thick fogs that can reduce visibility to near zero in minutes. Darkness and obscurity. It waits for cover. Ben's words echoed in my mind, as clear as if he were sitting across from me. I knew, with a certainty that was absolute and sickening, I knew what had happened to that family. The protocol of silence had not contained the phenomenon. It had only contained the truth. And in our silence, the groves were still hunting. The long-term ecological study had a new entry in its ghost file. A family of 3. Erased. In that moment, I understood that my silence was not a pragmatic necessity. It was cowardice. It was a betrayal of every oath I had ever taken as a ranger to protect human life. It was a betrayal of Julian Croft, and of this new family, and of however many others there had been over the decades. Their stories filed away in a cabinet of institutional denial. The protocol wasn't protecting the parks. It was protecting the bureaucracy. It was feeding the beast. And so I am speaking now. I am breaking the protocol. I know the risk I am taking. I have no proof to offer you. The laptop I showed Director Rostova is gone, likely in a classified evidence locker or at the bottom of a smelter. Ben Carter is 1,000 miles away, a gilded prisoner of his own success. The data, the raw, undeniable footage, has been scrubbed from existence by men and women whose job it is to keep the world sane, even if it means lying about the nature of reality. All I have is my word, the testimony of an old, tired man who once looked behind the curtain and saw something he was never supposed to see. I know that what I've told you sounds like the ramblings of madness. It flies in the face of everything we know of science, of reason, of common sense. And maybe you should dismiss it. It is certainly the easier thing to do. But if you don't, if a small part of you feels the cold ring of truth in my words, then I have accomplished what I set out to do. The next time you find yourself in a deep, old forest, one of those sacred, silent places where the trees are ancient and the air is heavy with time, I want you to do more than just admire the view. I want you to pay attention. Listen to that small, primal voice in the back of your mind, the one that our noisy, modern world has taught us to ignore. Trust your instincts. If the silence feels too deep, if the stillness feels too watchful, if you get the sudden, inexplicable feeling that the path behind you has changed or is no longer there, maybe it has. Maybe you should turn around and walk away. Don't run. Panic is loud. Just turn, calmly, and walk back the way you came. And hope that the ancient, patient consciousness of the grove has not yet taken notice of you. Hope that the forest has decided, for its own unknowable reasons, to let you go. Thank you for listening. The world is full of mysteries, and we have only scratched the surface of what the wilderness holds. If you have had an unexplainable experience in a remote place, a moment where the rules of the world seem to bend or break, we invite you to share your story, respectfully, in the comments below. And if you wish to explore more of the unknown, please consider subscribing to the Wilderness Protocol and enabling notifications. Your support allows us to continue searching for the stories that lie hidden in the quietest, darkest corners of our world.